So as we move up the biological hierarchy, we're now going to look at community ecology, right? So we've gone from organisms through most of the quarter to population, biology, now to community ecology. And so this is going to be all the living individuals in an area, all the populations in an area. How do they interact? And clearly they're going to interact. Each organism is some part of another organism's environment. One of the most important concepts when it comes to community ecology is the niche or niche, and this is going to happen. This is going to influence our evolution significantly, right? Because remember, fitness and natural selection is going to be based on how well you utilize your resources, right? And so the more fit you are, the better you are at utilizing resources, the more babies you can have, the more your genes are passed on. Okay? So the niche, though, can be very, very specific. It's the role a species plays in its community. It's the resources it utilizes and produces. So even in a population that is very successful, utilizing maybe uh, a producer as a resource, eating plants, they themselves are a resource. They're providing food for a carnivore that eats them, right? So it's really important to think of that way. And we'll look at trophic levels and how energy moves through an ecosystem in just a couple minutes. But you may look at these different warblers and say, oh, these warblers all live in this tree. But in fact, if you look at it in more detail, you see that each has a very specific area of the tree that they occupy. And those become very different niches. And so subtle differences can then provide different areas of resource for individuals. So that's important. So again, I don't often put a lot of text in a slide, but these are important definitions. The niche, the role a species plays in its community, and the resources it utilizes and produces, right? Now, the problem is when you have two species competing for the same resources, and that is competition. When individuals of different species compete for finite resources that limit growth, survival, reproduction success, right? So this leads to a really important concept called competitive exclusion. And this basically says that um, increased reproductive advantage conferred by more efficient resource use eliminates the less efficient species. So this happens very rarely, and that's why we look at those warblers, because it is a rare event in any kind of established ecosystem that two species will share the exact same niche, that will be competing for resources in the exact same niche. Because given enough time, any two species that are competing for the exact same resources, one will win and one will lose. And what determines which one will win is the one that uses the resources more efficiently. So there's all kinds of competition, right? So we look at diversity in a community. You look at different kinds of trees. Well, these have the same number of different species, but the bottom example shows you one species being much more efficient in resource utilization for whatever reason that may be, on a physiological level, on how it reproduces, what have you, but it is now outcompeting the other species, right? Competition can be between very different species for different reasons. So here's a polar bear who's like, well, I need to eat. This is the beach from which I hunt, I eat, and the walrus is like, well, this is where I need the beach for mating, but there's still competition here. So all kinds of competition out there. Now, if two species are competing for exactly the same resources, like I said, competitive exclusion kicks in, and one will not make it. And so these kind of a classic examples. You look at different paramecium species, and the first species and the second species, grown alone under the same conditions, have very similar growth curves. You see that logistic growth curve plateaus out once we reach the carrying capacity. But if you put them both into the same environment with the same resources, one wins and one loses. And why might that be? Subtle differences in how they process food, how they reproduce, what have you. But ultimately, for those given conditions, one of them, because they're not the same, one of them is going to do a better job, and given enough time, will win. So that idea of niche is very important. Now, what it leads to is the building of a community structure. And this then begs the question of, how do feeding relationships move through a community, right? How does energy ultimately move through a community? And what we call this is trophic structure, a pattern of feeding relationships consisting of different levels. And so this is a concept that most people are very familiar with, but if you're not, it's called a food chain. right? So we have primary producers on a first level. These have got to be autotrophs. Oh, vocabulary we've talked about in the past. So autotrophs make their own food. So in most cases, on a terrestrial environment or on the surface of the planet, we're going to be looking at photosynthesizers. So plants are going to be our primary producers, right? They make their own food. Then you have primary consumers, which could be herbivores, and then secondary consumers, which eat those primary consumers, and so on and so forth, right? So you're moving your way up the chain, moving ultimately that sunlight energy that was captured by the plants up through the different animals. Okay. Now the efficiency of that is not perfect, and we'll look at that in a second. Now the food chain is a simple model, but at the same time, it's not necessarily as accurate as it could be. In many cases, it's more like a food web, where you have multiple consumers on each resource, right? So there are many consumers on the producers, and then some consumers are on several levels, so a secondary consumer and a primary consumer, because they're both they're omnivores. They'll eat vegetation, but they'll also eat other animals. So these complex relationships can form, and we call them food webs, right? So they can be, terrestrial, or they can be aquatic. But the thing I want you to remember about these is, don't forget the importance of the detritivores. So you see that gray line on the right, waste and dead organisms. The detritivores are prokaryotes, are fungi, and our nematodes are three big decomposers, right? And so that's really, really important to make this system work, because we have to recycle the material resources. So the only thing that's kind of limitless that's moving through the system is the energy, because that's coming from the sun. Everything else has to be recycled. The carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, all the materials, the organic compounds, to keep the system flowing. So decomposers, super important. Now, like I said, energy doesn't move through this system perfectly efficiently. So there are limits to how far a system can go. And we don't often see a food chain go beyond 4 or 5 levels. Okay? And this is because of what's called the rule of 10. So the rule of 10 says, it's a rule of thumb, but in general, only about 10% of the energy at any given trophic level can be used to build the next level. So you can really only move 10% of the energy at one level up to the next level. So let's look at this example, this pyramid here. So you have 1,000,000 kilocalories, so it's just a unit of energy of sunlight coming in. And of that, plants are capturing and converting about 10,000 kilocalories worth of sunlight into actual plant material. So if I took that field of plants and converted it to energy, burned it, I get 10,000 kilocalories out of it. Okay, so that's actual material that can be accessed. So if along comes a primary consumer, that primary consumer can consume the producer and convert that 10,000 kilocalories worth of plant material into 1,000 kilocalories worth of grasshopper material, right? It's not efficient. 90% of that energy is lost in the process, right? And then so on and so forth. So what this says is that you can't have an infinite number of steps in the food chain, because the base isn't big enough, right? So the base would have to be huge to keep going, because it has to support ultimately every step of the way, and the energy is lost at every conversion, right? And this is just physics. So when you look at that, you can say, well, here's a caterpillar, here's a primary consumer eating the producer. You would say, well, only about, in this case, 15% of it is going to new biomass, right? Whereas 100 of it is lost. Like, it can't even be accessed. It's destroyed, quote unquote, as plant material, but passed through the organism, feces. 30% of it is used for cellular respiration. So this is just maintenance. And so then only about 15%, that 33 joules is just another energy unit, can be actually used to build new caterpillar, right? And so that's where we have this inefficiencies. So what that asks then is the question of, where do we fit on the food pyramid? How do we manage our own ecosystem? And I am not a proponent or deter you from eating as a vegetarian. I happen to eat meat. I have been vegetarian in my life, but if you look at the numbers here and think about the number of people on the planet, being lower in that trophic structure is going to enable more people to be around, right? So if that's your goal, then we need more humans eating lower on the trophic levels than going through more transitions of energy, converting the energy in the corn into meat and cattle, and then converting cattle into people, right? So now, last thing about community ecology is that some organisms have undue influence, right? So again, it's about interaction between species. So the first kind of category of species influence is the dominant species. So these are species with substantially higher abundance or biomass than other species. So if you think about firs or pines in a coniferous forest, they clearly affect all the other species because they're kind of the environment, right? They're kind of the substrate because they're so abundant. Or the grasses on the plains, right? So they're going to dominate the environment and have undue influence on the environment just simply because there's so much of them. So that seems pretty straightforward. Now, the next example of a species that has undue influence or disproportional influence is called a keystone species. So keystone species are not necessarily the most abundant, but play a pivotal role in the ecosystem because they occupy what's called a vital niche. And so keystones are the stone that support the arch, right? So when you're building an arch, that keystone at the very top is what everything presses against, and with gravity, then everything can hold together. If you remove that keystone, boom, the whole thing falls apart. So the example here from the Pacific Northwest is the sea otter as a keystone species. So what you see here on the left is the kelp forest, which is eaten by or preyed upon by the sea urchins. But the sea urchin population is kept in check by the sea otters, right? So you get a perturbation of the system when overfishing forces orcas, which normally eat the fish that we've now taken from them, to start preying upon the sea otters. And so when you see the sea otter population drop, all of a sudden the urchin population goes up, and then you get a crash in the kelp population. With the kelp being the producer, if that crashes completely, now you've destroyed the ecosystem completely. So this idea of the keystone species occupying a vital niche is important to understand, right? So these food webs very interconnected. Now the final example of a species with undue influence is called a foundation species, or they used to call them ecological engineers, but these are an example is a beaver. Right? So these influence ecosystems not by their trophic interactions, not by what they're eating or consuming or providing, but by their influence on the physical environment. So if you look here, when a beaver builds a dam, they're not eating anything per se. They may be taking down some trees, but the point is that they've created now a whole pond, a whole body of water that wasn't there before. And that changes the ecosystem significantly because they're physically affecting the environment. Humans are clearly foundation species. We modify our environment significantly to promote our survival. So this is more stuff that we can talk about in class and lab. But again, any of this stuff, if it's interesting to you, read more deeply because we are just touching on the very basics.